In the beginning, God created the universe and a planet called Earth. Humans were formed in God's image to continue God's work. But soon, humans decided we want to live our way, not God's. Selfishness and violence filled the world, so God started over with just one family. And God made a covenant with a man named Abraham. The land around you is now yours. Your family will be my blessing to the entire world. In just a few generations, they grew into a large nation named Israel. The Egyptians became fearful and forced the Israelites to be their slaves. Through a humble leader named Moses, God led the Israelites in a great exodus back toward their promised land. Along the journey, God gave laws and commands to help the Israelites follow God's ways. Finally, after 40 years of struggle and complaining in the desert, the Israelites arrived back home in the promised land. In victory, the people worshipped God, but soon after, they turned from God and lived their own rebellious ways. This became a pattern from generation to generation. Now living back in their promised land, Israel continually struggled to follow God's ways. So Saul became Israel's first king. But he led the country poorly and turned his back on God. So God chose a courageous young man named David to be king. God blessed Israel greatly under David's leadership. David passed on his throne to his son, Solomon, who was full of God's wisdom. Solomon built a magnificent temple, but as the years passed, Solomon strayed from God, and the country was torn apart in civil war. So God sent prophets as messengers to challenge the Israelites to return to God's better ways. But they wouldn't listen. God's people were forced out of the promised land, the temple was destroyed, and many were taken away as slaves. But God was still watching over them, speaking words of hope through the prophets. 60 years later, this hope was realized when the Jewish people were freed to return to their promised land. God's prophets pointed to the future and a coming king, one who would fully restore Israel and bring a new kingdom of peace. So the Jewish people waited and hoped, and God would not speak through the prophets again for 400 years. 400 years passed since God spoke through the prophets. They were now ruled by the Roman Empire, and the Jewish people longed for a Messiah to come and liberate them. Then, Mary, a young woman still a virgin, gave birth to a boy named Jesus, meaning one who saves. Angels announced that he was the Messiah King. Overjoyed, a group of shepherds ran to tell everyone in sight. This birth was truly a miracle. When Jesus grew up, he faced the same temptations as all people, but always chose to follow God's ways. Jesus showed his closest followers, called disciples, how to live in the ways of God. He told them, "The kingdom of God has come. Now turn from your ways to God's ways." Using profound stories called parables, Jesus challenged the Jewish people to search for the deep realities of God's kingdom. As crowds surrounded Jesus everywhere, he felt compassion for them, giving them food, healing their illnesses, and even raising people from the dead. Jesus was a different kind of king than expected. He wasn't a military leader. Instead, he led through compassion, justice, and loving those who were forgotten. The religious leaders were jealous of Jesus' huge following and shocked by his claims to be God's son. He must be stopped, they thought. One night, while Jesus was praying, they sent an armed mob to drag him away. Horrified, his disciples ran away and hid. The religious leaders questioned Jesus. "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see me seated next to God in power." Enraged, the leaders shouted, "Any man who claims to be God must be executed." Pressured by the religious leaders and an angry crowd, the Roman governor sentenced Jesus to death. Like a criminal, Jesus was nailed to a wooden cross between two thieves. He cried out, "Father, please forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Darkness filled the skies, and Jesus breathed his last breath. Jesus was buried in a tomb and guarded by Roman soldiers. 2 days later, Jesus' followers came to prepare his body for burial, but he and the soldiers were gone. Jesus began appearing, first to 2 men walking along the road, then to over 500 eyewitnesses. Weeks after Jesus' resurrection, he met with his disciples for a meal. Jesus encouraged them, "You'll never be alone. Soon God's Spirit will come and live inside of you, empowering you to live in my ways and change the world." As the disciples watched, Jesus disappeared into the clouds right in front of them. A few weeks later, 120 of Jesus' followers were praying. All of a sudden, God's Spirit filled them and they began speaking in other languages. People throughout the city were amazed. Thousands then believed in Jesus as Messiah. This was the beginning of the church, a community all over the world called to live in God's kingdom ways. Empowered by God's Spirit, Jesus' followers healed the sick, fed the hungry, and cared for the poor. The church spread all over the region, but they faced great persecution. Jailed, beaten, and even put to death for what they believed. A man named Saul was leading the charge to destroy the church. Suddenly, he was blinded by a light, and Jesus spoke to him, calling him to work for good. From that moment on, Saul began starting new churches and reaching those outside the Jewish faith with the kingdom message. Years later, Jesus' disciple John was given a vision for how this great story will end. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and God lived among us, wiping away every tear and taking away all death and pain. God will make everything new. We are the continuation of this amazing story, a community called to live in God's kingdom ways and bless the entire world.